It was a regular Saturday morning at Fresh Value Supermarket in downtown Portland. The Liu family had just walked in through the sliding glass doors, pushing their shopping cart as they did every weekend. Helen Liu, a soft-spoken woman in her early 40s, was checking her shopping list, while her husband David guided their cart past the colorful flower display at the entrance. Their 8-year-old daughter Emily skipped alongside them, her two pigtails bouncing with each step. The supermarket was busy as usual, filled with the familiar sounds of shopping carts rolling, cash registers beeping, and the quiet hum of conversation. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted from the bakery section, making Emily's stomach growl. She hadn't eaten breakfast because she was too excited about their weekly shopping trip. It was the only time she got to help pick out special treats for her school lunches. As they walked through the produce section, Emily spotted something that made her eyes light up. Dragon fruits were on sale. She remembered trying them at her best friend Zara's house last week and loving their sweet taste. "Mom, can we get some dragon fruits?" she asked, pointing at the pink fruits. Helen smiled warmly and nodded, watching as Emily carefully selected two perfect pieces. What the Liu family didn't notice was a woman in her 50s, wearing an expensive-looking blue coat, who had been following them since they entered the store. She kept her distance but watched their every move with narrowed eyes, clutching her designer purse tightly whenever they came near. Her name was Karen Davidson, and she was a regular customer known among the staff for always complaining about something or the other. The peaceful morning shopping trip was about to take an unexpected turn that would not only change the Liu family's day, but would also reveal both the ugly and beautiful sides of their community. None of them knew that in just a few minutes, their ordinary Saturday morning would become something they would never forget. As Emily reached for another dragon fruit, she accidentally bumped into a display of apples. A few apples rolled onto the floor, and David quickly bent down to pick them up. That's when Karen Davidson saw her chance. She marched straight toward them, her heels clicking loudly on the tile floor. The sound made Emily look up, and she immediately sensed something wasn't right. "Just look at this mess!" Karen's voice was so loud that several other shoppers stopped what they were doing. "This is exactly what happens when you let your children run wild in the store." Her face was red with anger that seemed much bigger than just some fallen apples. Helen instinctively pulled Emily closer to her side. David stood up slowly, still holding the apples he had collected. "I'm very sorry about this. We're picking everything up," he said calmly, trying to keep the peace. But Karen wasn't interested in his apology. She took a step closer, and the look in her eyes made Emily grip her mother's hand tighter. "You people are always causing problems," Karen continued, her voice getting even louder. "First you bring the virus here, and now you can't even teach your children basic manners." Other customers started to gather around, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Emily could feel her eyes filling with tears, not fully understanding why this stranger was so angry, but knowing it had something to do with how her family looked. An elderly couple shopping nearby shook their heads in disapproval, but surprisingly they weren't looking at the Liu family. They were staring at Karen with obvious disgust. A young mother shopping with her toddler quickly moved away from Karen's side of the aisle, giving Helen a sympathetic look as she passed. The situation was getting worse by the second. Karen was now standing so close to David that he could smell her expensive perfume. She jabbed her finger toward his chest, her voice shaking with anger as she started to say something else. But before she could continue her rant, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Standing at the end of the aisle was Michael Chen, the store manager, his name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He was younger than most people expected a manager to be, probably in his early 30s, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made even Karen take a small step back. Little did anyone know, but Michael's arrival was about to change everything about this situation, in ways that nobody in the store could have predicted. Michael Chen walked towards the group with steady steps, his face serious but calm. What nobody in the store knew was that Michael had his own painful history with situations like this. 20 years ago, his own parents had faced similar treatment in this very neighborhood, and back then, no one had stood up for them. But today was going to be different. "Mrs. Davidson," Michael said, his voice firm but professional, "I couldn't help but overhear your comments." Karen's face changed quickly from anger to surprise. She hadn't expected the manager to know her name, but of course he did. She had complained to him at least a dozen times before about everything from expired coupons to the music being too loud. "Well, I'm glad you're here," Karen said, trying to sound confident. "These people's daughter made a mess, and they—" But Michael raised his hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. The small crowd of onlookers grew larger, and Emily peeked out from behind her mother to watch what was happening. "I saw everything on our security cameras," Michael explained, pointing to the black dome on the ceiling. "It was a simple accident, one that happens in this store at least 10 times a day. But what I also saw and heard was you making racist comments about a family who are valued customers of our store." Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "I shop here every week. I spend thousands of dollars in this store. How dare you accuse me of—" But again, Michael didn't let her finish. Something unexpected happened next. He smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile or an angry one. It was sad and knowing, the kind of smile that suggested he had seen this story play out too many times before. "Mrs. Davidson," he said quietly, "would you like to know something interesting?" He paused, looking around at the gathering crowd, then at the Liu family, and finally back at Karen. The dragon fruit that Emily was looking at when she bumped into the apple display? Those were specially ordered because Mrs. Liu suggested them in our customer survey last month. Thanks to her suggestion, our international food section has become the most popular aisle in the store. A murmur went through the crowd. Helen's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to actually read her suggestions, let alone act on them. But Michael wasn't finished. He had something else to say, something that would change the entire atmosphere in the store and teach everyone present an unexpected lesson about community and belonging. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened a photo and held it up for everyone to see. The image showed a much younger Helen Liu standing in front of the very same supermarket. But the building looked different, older, more worn down. "Mrs. Liu," Michael said, his voice becoming softer. "You probably don't remember this, but 15 years ago you used to bring hot soup to my mother when she worked the night shift here as a cleaner." Helen's hand flew to her mouth as the memory came rushing back. Before she had become a teacher when she had first moved to the neighborhood, she worked at the small Chinese restaurant across the street. Every night she would bring leftover soup to the elderly cleaning lady who reminded her of her own mother back home. "That cleaning lady was my mother," Michael continued, his eyes becoming slightly wet. "She told me how you were the only person who would talk to her during those long night shifts, how you taught her English during your short breaks, and how you shared stories about home." The crowd had gone completely silent now, hanging onto every word. Karen stood frozen, her expensive purse hanging limply at her side. Her face had lost its angry red color and now looked pale and uncertain. Emily, who had been scared just moments ago, stepped out from behind her mother completely, fascinated by this story she had never heard before. "But here's what you don't know, Mrs. Liu," Michael went on, now speaking directly to Helen. "Those English lessons you gave my mother, they gave her the confidence to apply for a day shift position. She eventually became a supervisor, and the money she earned helped put me through business school." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And now, 15 years later, I'm the manager of this store. The same store where my mother used to clean floors at night." The silence in the store was broken by someone sniffling. It was the elderly woman who had been watching everything unfold. She was wiping her eyes with a tissue, and she wasn't the only one. Several other customers were visibly moved by this unexpected connection between the store manager and the Liu family. But the story wasn't over yet. Michael had one more surprise that would not only change Karen's perspective, but would also transform this ugly incident into something that would bring the entire community together in a way nobody could have predicted. Michael took a deep breath and looked directly at Karen. "Mrs. Davidson, do you remember last Christmas when you couldn't find your wallet? And you were worried about buying food for your holiday dinner?" Karen's face changed from pale to surprised. Other customers leaned in, curious about where this was going. "You were crying at the customer service desk," Michael continued gently. "Your grandchildren were coming over for Christmas dinner, and you were so upset about possibly disappointing them." Karen nodded slowly, her hands now trembling slightly as she remembered that difficult day. "Yeah, What you didn't know was that the person who found your wallet in the parking lot and turned it in with all your money still inside was Mrs. Liu. Michael gestured toward Helen. She had finished her shopping and was walking to her car when she saw your wallet in a puddle. She didn't just turn it in, she waited for almost an hour to make sure it got back to its owner safely. Karen's eyes widened as she looked at Helen. "That was you?" she whispered. Her voice completely different now, no longer angry but small and shocked. Helen nodded quietly and added something that made the situation even more touching. "I remember you were wearing that same blue coat," Helen said softly. "When I saw how worried you were about your grandchildren's dinner, it reminded me of my own mother, who always said that family meals are sacred. That's why I waited. I would have wanted someone to do the same for my family." Emily, who had been listening carefully, suddenly spoke up. "Mom, is that why we were late for my piano lesson that day?" Helen smiled and nodded at her daughter. The simple question from a child somehow made the whole story even more powerful. Now, one of the teenage employees who had gathered to watch pulled out his phone and showed something to his coworker. Word had begun spreading through social media about what was happening in the store. The local community Facebook group was lighting up with messages, and people were starting to come into the store just to witness what was unfolding. Among these newcomers was someone whose arrival would add yet another unexpected layer to this already emotional situation. A face from Karen's past that would help her understand even more deeply the impact of her actions and words. As this person walked down the aisle towards the group, no one could have predicted how their presence would change everything yet again. An elderly Asian woman in a nurse's uniform walked slowly toward the group. Her name tag read Zara Chen, and she looked tired, like she had just finished a long shift. Karen's face went completely white when she saw her. This was Zara, the nurse who had taken care of Karen's husband in the hospital just 3 months ago when he had his heart attack. "Nurse, I saw the posts online about what was happening here," Zara said, her voice gentle but firm. "I recognized your photo, Mrs. Davidson. I had to come straight from my hospital shift because I couldn't believe it was the same person." She paused, looking at Karen with disappointment in her eyes. "Do you remember what you said to me in the hospital?" Zara asked. "After I stayed 4 hours past my shift to sit with your husband, when you needed to go home and rest?" The store was so quiet now that you could hear the soft music playing over the speakers. Karen's eyes filled with tears. "You told me I was your angel," she whispered. "You said you would never forget my kindness." Her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped her purse. Emily, in a moment of pure childhood innocence, picked it up and handed it back to her. "That's right," Zara continued, then turned to face the crowd. "And what you don't know, Mrs. Davidson, is that Helen Liu's daughter Emily here volunteers at our hospital's children's ward every Saturday afternoon. She reads stories to sick kids, including your own grandson Tommy when he was in for his asthma treatment last month." Emily's face lit up with recognition. "Tommy is your grandson? He's the one who loves dragon fruit. That's why I was so excited to see them today. I was going to tell him about it next time I visit." The simple honesty in Emily's voice made several people in the crowd tear up. Michael stepped forward again. "You see, Mrs. Davidson, this store isn't just a place to buy groceries. It's where our community comes together. Every person here has a story, and these stories are all connected in ways we don't even realize." He gestured to the growing crowd of people. "The donations you make at our checkout for the local food bank? Mrs. Liu organizes the distribution every week. The Christmas toy drive you participated in last year? Emily and her mom helped wrap all those presents." But just as it seemed the situation was resolving, a local news van pulled up outside the store. Through the large front windows, everyone could see reporters getting their cameras ready. This development was about to take the story in yet another unexpected direction, one that would transform this incident into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The sight of the news van made Karen's face fill with shame. She looked desperately at Michael, then at Helen. "Please," she whispered, "I can't have this on the news. My grandchildren?" Her voice broke as tears started rolling down her cheeks. Helen surprised everyone by stepping forward and touching Karen's arm gently. "Michael," she said firmly, "can we close the blinds on the front windows? I don't think this needs to be a news story." Michael nodded and quickly sent an employee to lower the store's large window blinds, blocking the view from outside. What happened next shocked everyone. Karen slowly sank to her knees in front of Emily, not caring about her expensive clothes touching the store floor. I am so sorry, she said, her voice shaking. When I look at you now, all I can see is how you sat and read stories to my Tommy when he was scared in the hospital. How could I have been so blind? Emily, with the pure forgiveness that only children can show, reached out and hugged Karen. It's okay, she said simply. Tommy showed me pictures of you. He said you make the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. A few laughs mixed with sniffles came from the crowd of onlookers. Zara Chen, still in her nurse's uniform, joined the conversation. You know what we could do instead of making this a sad news story? She suggested. Why don't we show people how a community comes together? She turned to Michael with a spark in her tired eyes. Remember that empty space next to the store? The one you were thinking of using for expansion? Michael's face lit up as he caught her meaning. The community garden project we've been planning? He asked. The one we couldn't get enough volunteers for? Karen stood up slowly, wiping her eyes. I have experience with gardening, she said quietly, and I know several members of my garden club who would love to help. She looked at Helen hesitantly. That is, if you'd be willing to work with me? Helen smiled warmly. Actually, she said, I've been teaching my students about traditional Chinese vegetables. Maybe we could have a section for plants from different cultures? Emily could give tours to the children from the hospital when they're feeling better. The energy in the store began to change. What had started as an ugly incident was transforming into something beautiful. But as people started getting excited about the garden project, nobody noticed a young teenager in the crowd recording everything on his phone. His social media post about what he was witnessing was about to make this story go viral in a way that would bring unexpected attention and opportunity to their small community. By Monday morning, the teenager's video had over 1 million views on TikTok. The clip showed Karen's apology, Emily's hug, and the spontaneous community garden planning, all in a 2-minute video that touched hearts across the country. The comments section was filled with people sharing their own stories of forgiveness and community healing. The local news station, which had been turned away from the original incident, now had a different story to tell. They interviewed Michael about the community garden project, and as he talked about his plans, something amazing started happening. Local businesses began calling the store, wanting to help. The hardware store across the street offered to donate gardening tools. The lumberyard promised materials for raised beds. Even the fancy restaurant downtown wanted to buy vegetables from the garden once it was producing. But the biggest surprise came from Tommy, Karen's grandson, who had started a fundraising page online for the garden project. Grandma told me everything, Tommy said during his video call with Emily, which Helen had helped set up. I want to help make the garden awesome. Maybe we could have a special section just for dragon fruits? Emily's excited squeals made everyone in the Liu household smile. Karen, who had been afraid to show her face in public after the incident, found herself back at the supermarket that afternoon. This time, she came with a stack of papers. These are my grandmother's recipes, she explained to Helen, her voice still carrying a trace of nervousness. She was famous for her cookies, but she also had some amazing vegetable soup recipes. Maybe we could share them in the community newsletter you write. Helen's eyes lit up. Only if you'll let me share my mother's dumpling recipe too, she replied warmly. And maybe we could do cooking demonstrations in the garden once it's ready? Teach people how to use the vegetables they grow? The store had become busier than ever, but not just with regular shoppers. People were coming in to sign up as garden volunteers, to donate supplies, or simply to meet the people from the video. Zara Chen had started a schedule for hospital patients to visit the garden site once it was ready, believing in the healing power of nature and community. Michael watched all this activity from his office window, thinking about how his mother would react to all this. He picked up his phone to call her, knowing she would want to be part of this too. But before he could dial, he noticed something on his computer screen that would take this community project to an even bigger level. An email from someone very important who had also seen the viral video. The email that made Michael's heart skip a beat was from Michelle Wong, the famous TV chef whose cooking show was watched by millions. She had seen the viral video and wanted to do something special. I would love to film a special episode about community healing through food, she wrote. Your store's story touched my heart because it reminds me of my own family's struggles and triumphs. When Michael shared the news with Helen and Karen, who were now meeting regularly to plan the garden, both women couldn't believe it. But we're just ordinary people, Karen said, still getting used to positive attention after the incident. Helen smiled and patted her hand. Maybe that's exactly why people connect with our story. Tommy and Emily had become the unofficial faces of the youth volunteer program for the garden. They made short videos together showing the progress of the construction, with Tommy explaining the garden layout and Emily teaching viewers how to say vegetable names in Chinese. Their sweet friendship and enthusiasm made their videos go viral too. Zara Chen's hospital colleagues had joined in as well. They started a program called Grow and Heal, where patients could request seeds to be planted in their name in the garden. The idea was so popular that they had to expand the garden's original size. The empty lot next to the supermarket was now buzzing with activity every day. One afternoon, while volunteers were setting up the garden beds, an elderly Chinese woman walked slowly through the site, leaning on her cane. It was Michael's mother, Mrs. Chen, the former night cleaner. She stopped to watch Emily and Tommy playing near the newly installed fountain, which had been donated by a local business. You know, Mrs. Chen said to Helen, who was nearby planning the herb section, 15 years ago when you used to bring me soup, I never imagined something like this. She gestured at the busy garden site. Back then I felt so alone. But look at us now. All these people working together, growing things together. Karen, who was marking spots for the rose bushes she had donated, overheard this. She walked over, dirt on her once pristine clothes, and asked Mrs. Chen something that surprised everyone. Would you teach me how to make that soup Helen used to bring you? I think we should serve it at our garden's opening ceremony. But just as Mrs. Chen was about to answer, Emily came running up with Tommy's tablet in her hands. On the screen was another surprise, one that would make their community project famous across the entire country and change their small town forever. On Emily's tablet was a video message from the First Lady herself. She had seen both the original viral video and all the community garden updates. Your story shows what makes America beautiful, she said in the message. I would be honored to visit your garden opening next month and plant the first tree with you all. The news spread through the garden like wildfire. Mrs. Chen sat down on a newly installed bench, overwhelmed with emotion. Karen quickly brought her a glass of water while Helen held her hand. Both women now treated Michael's mother like their own mom, often bringing her special treats and taking turns driving her to doctor's appointments. The whole town sprang into action for the upcoming visit. Local schools, including the one where Helen taught, started planning cultural food programs. Karen's garden club members worked overtime to make sure every flower bed was perfect. The hospital where Zara worked decided to name their new healing garden program after Mrs. Chen, honoring her story of perseverance. Tommy and Emily became even more excited when they learned that the First Lady wanted to meet them personally after seeing their videos. But what should we show her first? Emily wondered out loud. The dragon fruit section or the friendship bridge? The bridge was a small decorative structure that connected the children's garden to the main garden, painted with handprints from all the young volunteers. I think we should show her this, Tommy said, pulling out a large scrapbook. Over the past month, he and Emily had collected stories from community members about their favorite family recipes and garden memory. The book was filled with photos, handwritten recipes, and stories in different languages, each one translated by volunteers. Karen's chocolate chip cookie recipe was on the same page as Helen's dumpling recipe, with a photo of both women teaching a cooking class together. On the day before the grand opening, Michael gathered everyone in the garden for a special moment. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the vegetables, flowers, and herbs that had begun to grow. Look around, he said, his voice full of emotion. 3 months ago, this was an empty lot. But more importantly, we were all strangers who judged each other without knowing our stories. Karen stood up then, something she had been practicing for weeks. In careful Mandarin that Mrs. Chen had taught her, she said, "We are family." Though her pronunciation wasn't perfect, the tears of joy in Mrs. Chen's eyes showed that it didn't matter. Emily and Tommy started clapping, and soon everyone joined in. As they all stood there in the garden they had built together, the evening light shining on faces of all ages and backgrounds, something became clear. What had started as an ugly moment in a supermarket had grown into something extraordinary. It wasn't just a garden they had created, but a new way of seeing each other. as neighbors, as friends, as family. The next day would bring cameras, reporters, and the First Lady. But this quiet moment with Mrs. Chen teaching Karen more Mandarin phrases, Helen and Zara planning next month's activities, and Emily and Tommy watering their dragon fruit plant. This was the real miracle. This was what happened when hate turned to love, when strangers became family, and when a community decided to grow together.